So I am here to be delighted to introduce Jeff to you. First, I just want to note that Jeff is going to share his personal experience about trauma, and just to recognise that that may be triggering for some of you. So if you do feel like you need to take a break, please remember to do them. Looking after yourself first and foremost is the most important thing. Jeff will bring an international perspective to it, and so also be aware some of the language that Jeff uses is from his context. So be curious to that and how we may hear and understand Jeff as he explains his life story and what's brought him to have the passion to share and lead around this area about leadership and resilience. Because understanding trauma, its impacts really matters to us here at Healthcare Improvement Scotland. As I said, my work means that we work increasingly with people who need and use mental health services, drug and alcohol services, and interface with our criminal justice system. The stories of their lives and how they experience health and social care more widely is central to how we think about redesigning and improving services so that they truly have people and what they need at their heart. Today's QI will exemplify how Jeff has used his experience to improve the lives of others. I know Jeff is here to tell his story, but I just want to give you a bit of background to introduce him. So Jeff has spent a large part of his life studying the effects of the criminal justice policies on young people, first as one of them whilst in prison and solitary confinement, then through studies and work. Once released from prison, Jeff earned a master's degree in criminal justice from St Ambrose University, as well as work in the criminal justice and child welfare field for a considerable portion of his life. He's here to share his experience in various leadership roles in residential treatment facilities, juvenile detention centres. He's also, as a profession close to my heart, worked as a social worker in the Iowa Department of Human Services, as well as crisis intervention for over 8 years. His role has been as varied to cover health facility surveyors for the State Department of Iowa and looked at complaints that have been regulated, monitored around adults, psychiatric units, residential facilities, juvenile detention centres, and you're always going to trip over that bit, youth emergency shelters, foster care, and a range of other places across Iowa. He was appointed by the governor and served a 2-year term on the Juvenile Justice Advisory Board and contributed to overseeing Iowa's use of juvenile justice and the Delinquency Prevention Act. Jeff will explain to you today just how much he is driven to change the way that young people in the criminal justice system are sentenced so that more people can find their true path. He draws on his own experience in working towards policies and procedures to achieve these goals, as he outlined in his TED Talk. The TED Talk he did, a Naperville talk in 2009, if you want to go and dig into that, which I would highly recommend, as he highlights there the effects trauma and the understanding how that trauma can affect the trajectory of young person's life. And as if that isn't a broad enough and important enough career, Jeff has most recently worked as the Assistant Professor of Criminal Justice and Human Services and Coordinator of Diversity at Iowa Wesleyan University, where he shared this valuable knowledge for upcoming the next generation. As Jeff tirelessly strives to bring about positive transformation, he's going to bring this experience to share with us today. So we're delighted that Jeff will discuss how trauma-informed care is being used in youth facilities and other systems of care, his own life incarceration from the age of 14, how he initiates trauma-informed approaches, and how he believes anyone can initiate the same changes. Leadership, courage and consistency all help resilience. So Jeff, I can't wait to hear more about it. Over to you.
Absolutely. And what I'll do first is, first of all, I want to thank Diana for introducing me. I appreciate that. And also I want to thank the HS Connect team, QI Connect team, for working very hard to make this happen. It's a very important and valuable opportunity to share lots of information. And so I want to make sure these slides are going. All right. And so, okay. I'm sharing the slides. 1 second here. All right. And I want to make sure this slide is showing, is it?
It's so we can see you now, Jeff.
Okay. And do you see the slide?
No.
Okay. Hold on. Okay. Technical problems, but we're gonna work
We're
through
going to
it.
get there. It's all good.
Yes, we are. All right. I'm gonna try it again. All right. Now, do you happen to see my screen?
No. I was
No, you
really
do not.
wanting to say yes there, but no.
Now, do you?
So Angela's put her slides back. I've got Angela's slides back up now.
Okay. All right. That is
Can you
great.
take?
I can
Yeah, do you
share
want-
them and progress them. Jeff.
Oh, you know what? I think I figured it out.
Oh,
Let me
allow,
know now if
you've
you
got
see
it.
it.
Yep.
You have it
Yep.
now?
That's it.
All right, we figured it out. We definitely figured it out. Thank everyone for your patience. And so what I'm going to do, like I had mentioned, I really appreciate everyone working together to make this happen. And as we get started,
Your slides have gone again, Jeff.
oh, they're gone again. All right.
So we'd
about
let
now?
Angela do it. Okay.
And they're still gone?
They're still gone. Should we just let Angela do it and you can just nod
Yes,
at
that's
Angela?
perfectly fine. I just gotta, yeah, because I don't know what okay, I take control. 1 second. I think I got it here. If I take control and then that. I can't take control any longer. Okay.
Angela, do you want to put your slides back up?
Yep, of course.
Oh, it says my request was not accepted. Okay.
Oh, you could
Okay, now it's
allow.
accepted.
Yep.
We're good to
that's
go
it,
now,
Jeff.
right?
Good. Yep.
Now we're good, right?
Yep.
Oh, okay. Now you should see my slide.
We can see your slide.
Okay, perfect. All right. And so I guess just to get started here, we had a bit of a bump, but nonetheless, mountains and valleys. Now, this is the tapestry of life. And in life, we often encounter challenges and hardships that kind of represent these mountains and valleys. And these hardships are going to test our resiliency. They're going to test our inner strength. And it is during this time we really figure out exactly who we are and how strong we are. But nonetheless, you take two people who experience the same tragic situation, and they will have drastically different results. One person may go on to live a fruitful life, have wife, husband, kids, live a productive life, while another may struggle with drug addiction, mental health issues, and so forth. Why this happens, we don't know all the ingredients that go into why somebody is going to be more resilient and why somebody isn't. But what we do know is that the younger a person is, that we can introduce these different interruptions and intervention tools with to allow them and help them become more resilient, the better chance that they are actually able to become more resilient. And so when we're looking at this ideal of trauma, what I want to do is make sure that we have sort of a base understanding. And at the risk of oversimplifying, I'm going to discuss exactly what trauma is. I'm going to discuss and I'm going to define what ACE scores are, what trauma-informed care is, and what systems of care are. And while we could go into these different terminologies and books and presentations have been done in multiple volumes on these, I just want to, for the purpose of this conversation, provide just a basic understanding. What's trauma? Well, trauma is an emotional response to a terrible event like an accident, an assault, a natural disaster. Now, trauma affects us all. It's indiscriminate and absolutely takes no prisoners. Now, I want you to just think about the idea that over 70% of adults in the United States population have experienced a traumatic event. And when you think about trauma, think of this here. You're at an intersection. And as you pull up to that intersection, you notice there's a car approaching from its left and its right. Immediately, your adrenaline system releases chemicals into your body that allows you to hear better, see better, and even provides a clearing of your sinuses. Now, your body is actually redirecting blood away from your brain and supplying to other parts of your body. Imagine every time that you are exposed and you are feeling this, it's another challenge, it's another mountain, if you will, that you have to trek back up to become resilient. And over time, the more that you're exposed to that feeling, the more normal it feels, and the less that you're actually going through the process of thinking through choices and decisions you make. That is trauma. Now, what are ACEs? Simply put, adverse childhood experiences is a way through a study years ago that allows us to be able to sort of quantify potentially traumatic events that occur in childhood, ages 0 to 17. And this is going to measure trauma related to violence in the home, self-harm in the community, neglect, family violence. And the reason why I want to make sure we discuss and know what that is, because as I mentioned in the very first slide, our ability to introduce interventions and interruptions into someone's life allows us to increase their chances to become more resilient. And so understanding now what trauma is and what ACE scores are, let's look at trauma-informed care. It is simply a coordinated approach to establish resiliency and empowerment in an organized effort to provide these interruptions. Now, when we think about someone in the emergency room or in the doctor's office who has a broke leg, and he or she may scream out in pain because they have a broken body part, and they may even become less cooperative. They may even become defiant. Our ability to work with this individual in a way that says, hey, it's okay, it's all right, to provide support and comfort is readily available. But for people who experience trauma, the broken parts of their body aren't always seen. And so a lot of times we're less likely to provide that support. And we review that defiance and we look at the way that someone responds in a way that says, basically, deal with them versus looking at them and saying, what happened to you versus what's wrong with you. So trauma-informed care provides this network at every point of entrance in this person in a particular system of care that allows for a better chance to become resilient. A system of care is pretty much a comprehensive spectrum of necessary services which are organized into a coordinated network to meet the multiple and challenging needs of families, individuals, children. And they could be anything from hospital environments to school settings, law enforcement interventions and interactions, mental health services, anywhere where we have a system of care where we have people that we need to meet their needs. And quite often in these systems of care is where we find people with the highest ACE scores. And remember, ACE scores is what's going to allow us to quantify how much trauma somebody has in fact experienced. So with all that understanding about those different terms that I just used, I want you to think about that. And I want you to think about the system of care that you actually work in today as I tell you a story. I find that stories are the best way to convey information. And so this story is a pretty simple story. It starts in a village at a river, and two villagers are at the river and they're talking to one another. And as they're talking to each other, one looks up and notices that down the river, there is a baby floating. And so one rushes to grab that baby and take care of that baby and make sure that baby's okay. And then they start looking it over, making sure that it has all its toes, fingers, it's not hurt, it's not injured. And as they're doing this with the one baby, the other villager looks up and there's another baby floating down. And so they then run and grab that baby. And while this is going on, other people in the village notice the commotion, they hear the noise, and they run over. And as they run over to figure out what's going on, they realize that there's another baby floating down the stream, and then another one. And pretty soon, there are lots of babies floating down the stream, and they've created these different levels of making sure that the baby's okay, maintaining the baby, and then making sure that they have a place to put the baby. And so at some point, somebody asked a very important question, which is probably what? Where are all these babies coming from? And they start sort of thinking to themselves that, was there an illness that has stricken the parents of these babies? Had there been some type of shoreline disaster that something like an earthquake that is, or some other natural disaster that's causing these babies to come down? Was there some person that's hateful throwing the babies in the river? Were there another set of villagers up the river that were exhausted and started abandoning the babies? And so at some point, they say, well, we need to, there's a group of villagers that says, we need to go up there and we got to figure out exactly what's going on. And another one says, no, we need all our resources here. And at this point, another person comes in and says, well, hold up. I noticed there are people that really do this really great job at bringing the baby in. But I also know that there are people that do a really great job of going to find the causes. And pretty soon, half stay there, the other half go up to figure out the results. And what we have here is we have a system of care. We have the preventive measures. We have the risk reduction, the maintaining, the stability, the stabilization portion. And then we have the aftercare portion. And this system of care is one that we often feel in whatever system of care we're working in. We feel exhaustion, compassion fatigue. And just like those babies that were floating down the river in this system of care, I was also one of these babies in a system of care. I grew up in a very poor environment. We lived in a 3-bedroom house, and we had 8 people in our family. So as you can imagine, there was not a lot of room for a lot of things. Oftentimes we would try to figure out exactly who was going to be where. Attention was not always given. And we're in different systems of care. You know, we're going to school. We're taking part in the welfare system. I can even remember that oftentimes, for the longest, I thought that not for sale was a brand name of food because that was what it said on the food that we received from the welfare office. It was embarrassing. It was stressful, but it was our lives. And if you look at this picture here, you will notice that we're all smiling. You'll see me looking lovingly over at my younger sister, and then my 4 older brothers and my 2 parents. Now, what you look at this picture, and I want you to think about this strongly when you think about the families you work with, everyone. Know that we had no shoes on in this picture, at least the kids didn't, because we just didn't have the money for it. And a lot of times we don't know what's going on, what's underneath it all, but we have a lot of things going on. And so in thinking about my story and in my system of care, I just want to point out that for me, going to school was stressful because a lot of times when you're in this environment, you don't always have the opportunity to get clean clothes. You don't always have the opportunity to be able to go to school and be able to have something to eat in your stomach all the times. We looked out for each other. We were there. And pretty soon, I was on probation by age 12, entering another system of care. I had already been taken out of the public school system, and I considered myself what I referred to as a junior high school dropout. Because by the time I was 14, I just left home. I was on probation. I was in alternative education. That meant that I was no longer in the public school system. There was an idea that I no longer achieved or I no longer deserved because of my behaviors, of course, to be in a public school system. And so at 14, I leave home. And by the time I am 17, I'm placed in multiple juvenile detention centers, various juvenile facilities. And as I'm going through these different facilities and juvenile programs, by the time I'm 17 and in my last juvenile facility, I decide to break out of the facility. It was a locked facility, and I decided that this was not something I wanted anymore. And so because of that, and because of the assault that I perpetuated on the staff, I was placed in prison by the time I was 17. This is where I became 1039-26083. I would go on to spend my 18th, my 19th, my 20th, my 21st, my 22nd, 23rd, and 24th birthdays in prison. Out of these 6 years, I would spend 4 years in solitary confinement. And I have to tell you that while I spent a lot of time in solitary confinement, that was terrible. It was rough, but I had no visits from anyone. I felt like I had been placed in a hole with no rope, no hope, no ability to climb out of it. So I sort of dug in. I became more defiant. My time in solitary confinement increased and increased. But I knew that while I was in solitary confinement, I knew that I was going to have to be able to come out not amongst the broken men. And I was there, I was going to learn the true understanding of resiliency. And that by making sure that I was not going to be counted amongst the broken men, I would somehow figure out a way to save myself. And eventually, after being in this, basically growing up in prison and juvenile facilities from the age of 14 on, I decided that, or at some point, I did get out. And in prison, I often wondered, how did I go from being that young person that in that first picture looked over lovingly at my little sister and amongst family to then becoming a junior high school dropout, juvenile delinquent, gang member, and then become 1039-26083. I thought about it a lot, and I wanted to know the ingredients that went into that. And that would become some of my passion that pushed me on in life. And so eventually I get out. And one of the things that I wanted to think about was, what did I learn? Especially while I was in prison, where you would think that I wouldn't have a lot of mentors, but in fact I did. I learned significant amount of guiding principles from the older prisoners that would often refer to me as the contentious young man, because as they would give me books to read, I would continue to go on and on with different arguments and so forth. But I learned strategies about how to become resilient, how to leave and never return. And so I stand by the fact that these principles and these strategies I learned from multiple different ways, including playing chess and having lessons intertwined into those chess games, to the books that I read. I am very convinced that these same strategies can be applied in your own life. But I knew that once I got out, that I needed to stay out. And the way I was going to do this was by living a redemptive life. And how was I going to do that? Well, my first thing to do was I needed to volunteer. I needed to give, because once you truly give, you receive, but you have to give without the idea of receiving. So I started volunteering at the same facility that I had broke out of, that I was placed in. I started working in these different facilities. I started actually finishing my initial degree, which was in pre-law, and then went on to work in these same facilities in a variety of capacities. In my introduction, you heard about the crisis intervention. And if you read through the screen, you'll see some of those other different things that I've done. I'm on the board of the Safer Foundation, which is an organization that helps citizens, returning citizens getting out of prison. I started my own company. I provide tons of consulting, but the thing that I'm most proud of is honestly going from and understanding the process of resiliency and going from 1039-26083 to Professor Wallace. Because this is where I never thought I was going to college. I never thought that there was going to be anything that I would do that was going to be of value. But the process of resiliency works in so many different ways. And from all my different trainings and my different aspects of education, I knew that there was multiple things that I needed to do to make this information out to others, as well as understand a little bit more about who I was, to understand more about who the people I'll be working with are. And I became a time traveler, where I would go back and say to youth what I wish somebody would have said to me. And so one thing was learning about trauma-informed care. And I became involved in this first at 2006. And when I first heard about it, it was love at first sight. It made so much sense. It answered so many different questions. It allowed me to truly understand and know more about what it was going to take to be able to provide these interventions and these interruptions that I so wished could have been provided to me, the ideal of a mentorship. the ideal of being able to have someone teach you something. And so as I'm looking at different ways, and I'm also getting different type of leadership roles, I knew that we needed to implement this. And so in my system of care that I was working in was a residential treatment facility, and ironically, the one that I was placed in. And while I was working in there, I knew that we had lots of different things that we needed to improve upon. And one was restraints. I was a kid in this facility. I knew what restraints felt like. And so over a 3-year period, we were able to, through leadership and understanding and communication, we're able to reduce the restraints by over 50% in a 3-year period. Now, this is what success looked like in my system of care. What it looks like for you and your system of care may be completely different, but it can happen. And again, think about your system of care. Think about the results that you want. Think about the ACE scores and how people who are affected by that do use healthcare or the emergency room as a primary physician. Why is that? Think about these things. But however you think about it, understand it's going to take leadership. It's going to take leadership to understand what it's going to take. And what is leadership? Leadership is something that we create and we manifest this daily. Leadership can come from anywhere at any point in time. It's not a top-down process. It's dynamic, it's non-sequential, it is truly transformational. It creates a system that lives on far beyond the person that creates the system that allows for the change to take place. It creates other leaders. It's not selfish. It's process focused, and it inspires others to do what a lot of times they thought they couldn't do. And the biggest thing about being able to understand trauma and being able to understand how it intertwines with leadership is understanding that we have to truly give. And as a person that was involved in so many different trauma-informed care processes and changes, I often wondered to myself, well, once we become resilient, what comes after that? What comes after resiliency? And then that's when I realized that after resiliency, there's thriving. And how can we truly thrive? And what is thriving? Thriving is the ability to sustain the changes that we have developed after becoming resilient. How do I thrive? How do our staff thrive? How do you come into this here space in your system of care and show up as your best version each and every day? Well, there's multiple ways that you can do it. And I often talk about this in a lot of different workshops I provide and things of that nature. But for the purpose of this discussion, the thing that I always highlight, if I can highlight anything, is that you have to value self-care. Self-care is important. Self-care has to be non-negotiable. It's what allows you to show up as your best version every single day. It allows you to keep your well full. For me, it's photography. For you, it may be something else. And if you look through the different photos that you see, you'll see the different things that I have captured. Because for me, it allows me to be in the moment. It allows me to truly be mindful of where I'm at, not worrying too much about the future, because if I do, that's anxiety, and not focusing on the past, because if I focus on the past, that is regret. And regret, as we know, is something that can drag us down. And instead, I'm in the moment and appreciate the presence. And my final words to you, from me as a person who's a time traveler, somebody who understands and knows that you've got to always think about your present position and what it took to get there and what it takes to be able to make sure that someone you're communicating at a different place, if you were there, what do you wish somebody would have said to you? And so I know that we have a lot of people who are listening today that are working with multiple different people who have high ACE scores. So just think about this. If I were to say to you, hey, here's $100 or 100 pounds, and would you take it if I gave it to you? Most would say yes. And then I said, well, hold up, I'm going to take that $100 and I'm going to stomp on it a little bit. Would you still take it? Most people would say yes. Of course, it's $100. Now, if I said, well, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to step on it. I'm going to sort of crumble it up and dirty it up. Are you still going to take it? And most people would say, yes, I'll still take it. And I said, well, hold up now. I'm going to step on it, crumble it up, and I'm going to rip it after I dirty it up. But I'll tape it back up and give it to you. Would you still take it? And quite overwhelmingly, the answer would be yes. And why is that? Well, it's simple. That's because the $100 doesn't lose its value. And I want you to think about the people you work with, because a lot of them have been stomped on. A lot of them have been felt like they've been torn in half. A lot of them have been crumbled up, thrown to the trash, and they don't lose their value either. But I'm gonna go a step further and say that as someone who provides services, if you're direct here or if you're in a leadership role, we know that oftentimes we are in a thankless job. We don't feel as though there is anything that we're doing. It seems like the efforts are just, they're not working. And even though sometimes you don't feel appreciated, you don't feel as though this is something you can keep doing it, keep in mind that while you may feel like you're being thrown away and ignored and your information's been thrown in the trash, you don't lose your value either. And so thank you for your time today. I hope that while we had a couple of technical difficulties, I believe we're able to get through it and provide some information. And at this point, I will open it up for questions.
Jeff, thank you so much. And as I expected, such a powerful story you've been able to share with us. Thank you so much. And there's been a lot of questions. I've been looking at them in the chat, but the first question I'm going to hand over to Ruth Robin, who's going to ask you your first question. Ruth.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Professor Wallace. That was inspiring. My question's around Scotland. So Scotland has a growing understanding of trauma and how it impacts the most vulnerable communities and those that have the most complex of needs. So we recognise that building trusting relationships takes time and continuity. What do you think we need to consider in Scotland in order to establish relationships and embed a trauma-informed approach?
Well, I think that what it comes down to is understanding the whole process of leadership. And there's three things that I'm going to identify that make this possible when I participated or when I have participated in it recently or in the very first time. Was that first, trauma-informed care is democratic, and it thrives and its foundation is on honesty. So you have to be very, very transparent and open. Be open, be very deliberate, and be very open about the results that we want to see. Secondly, and you share it amongst everyone that is a part of that process. And secondly, you make sure everyone understands that process so they can own a part of that process. Because once people own a part of the process, one of the biggest obstacles to trauma-informed care is buy-in. But when you own a piece of that process, when you own a part, you're more likely to buy in, because now you're not just someone where somebody's saying, here's something else for you, because we go to tons of trainings. And for me, the biggest turnaround was when I was able to say to the staff, hey, not only are we going to work with youth this way, but I'm going to also work with you this way as well. So we all are trauma informed in their approach with each other. And lastly, I would say that it has to be strategic. I would even go further to say that when these have worked out well, it's because there's a strategic plan. It's built into the culture. And as people own a piece, as there's transparency, you measure that. You measure that in a variety of ways, depending on what your results are and the system of care that you're in, so that you can then say, honestly, we're not where we need to be. This is what we need, and give honest critique and feedback. Because one of the aspects of trauma-informed care, or how we work with people, patients, consumers, and clients, is by being very open and honest with them and say, this is what we need, or this is what's going to happen with you, and so forth. So yeah, those three aspects are, I think, are what's needed to create and maintain a trauma-informed care environment amongst multiple systems of care, especially one that sort of creates a consortium where you have law enforcement, mental health professionals, drug and substance abuse professionals, first responders, and so forth.
Thank you, Jeff. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And so we've got a question from Wayne, one of our ADP coordinators, our alcohol and drug partnership coordinators, who we have a delight to do quite a lot of work with. And Wayne was reflecting about the difference between empathy that we might give to a young person when we hear about what has caused their trauma. For example, your own experience of poverty and that challenging upbringing. But that turns into stigma when about the resulting effects, whether that's about alcohol or drugs or criminal behaviour or mental health. So do you see these as similar or the same issue, and how might we work to tackle that stigma that comes with the impact of trauma?
Yes, that's a very good question, like the first one. And this is what I'll say is that one, I think with any time you work with anybody, the most transferable and organic way of being able to acknowledge something that someone has went through or is dealing with is by validation, right? Validation means that I understand, I hear you. This was rough. You're telling me it's rough. This is something that's significant to you. Now we need to help you. And the way that you get away from the stigma associated with it, and I've often actually been a part of a few different panel discussions about this, because in America, we talk, a lot of our resources are built around the cities, right? And in the rural areas, there's not many resources. And part of that means that everyone knows you went here and you went there. So there's a bigger stigma. And so what you do is you have to normalize through conversation, shared language, the idea that we're all going through something. We're all walking around here with broken parts that we need to understand, that we can see and not see. Because what that does is that allows for someone to have the off-ramp of trying to step back and be skeptical, because then they'll look introspective of themselves and say, well, hold up. You know what? Yeah, I did have some things going on. I was affected a little differently, but this person was affected this way. And I think that when you start connecting and you really take the time to get someone to see that there's a little part of us in everybody we meet. And our goal should be kind of to be able to see that part of that person so we can truly empathize with that person and not come across as a mechanical sympathizer. So I think the way to answer your question, to sum it up, to get rid of the stigmatization that goes with trauma and the things we've been through, is by being able to share and generalize and vocalize the fact that we all are going through something. And that gives people that off ramp to understand, you know what, this person needs just a little bit more. This person needs a little bit more. And I think once we do that, people are more likely to discuss it, acknowledge it. And that 70% number that I discussed earlier will probably increase when people verbalize and acknowledge what they are dealing with and what they're going through that they've been doing on their own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's all of us, isn't it, as humans? And so that sort of leads me on to a question that's come from Douglas, but and a couple of other people who've asked similar questions about the education of our professionals, and how do we move from both making the education about trauma a critical part of professionals' education, and how might we manage to achieve something like that, but also how do we move that past what is trauma-informed approaches, which the questioner sort of reflects can sometimes feel like a bit of a box ticking exercise, to something that's about trauma recovery, and how and the way that then staff and families can begin to not be re-traumatized by the constant interaction with the system, but kind of move and build themselves from that.
All right. Now, when I hear your question, there's a bunch of different things that jump up. And the thing that jumps up the most is the last part you just said, which is that just being in the system is traumatizing, right? We're giving families and people more hoops to jump through. And we've already jumped through many hoops. I think of the many hoops I jumped through as a youngster, right? For example, just my family of being able to get assistance. There's more hoops to jump through, more people in your life. You have the social worker who wants to know, what are you doing? Who's living there, and so forth. And so I think that, again, this comes down to being able to sort of interject and sort of place into all conversations the idea that people are suffering and dealing with things, but they're not necessarily it's not going to look the same. So, for example, in academia, it just took us having a conversation about what does it look like in a college setting, and also when you go out, because one of the best sort of things that I thought about when I was as a professor is that I'm now in a position to influence the next generation. So understanding ACE, understanding all these different sort of interwoven terminologies that are in trauma-informed care, but placing them out so they can see how they transfer. So one of the things I did with my students is that when they were trying to figure out what job they're going to do, and I wanted to expand their mind, I had them list out all their skills that they learned, that they can remember even outside of college. And what they were able to see is that there were transferable skills. And then that opened up their mind, and they seen that the world was much bigger than they thought, and their options much more than they thought, and they had more skills than they realized. So when you make the conversation more about where do I see this at here, where do I see this at there, then when professionals are working with these families, they're less likely and more willing, as policies made, to take away some of these different barriers, taken away from some of these different hoops that they want people to jump through. Because sometimes the hoops that they have to jump through are there because of that's the policy, that's the law. And so what I've noticed that when we're trying to create different influences of trauma-informed care with systems of care, especially at the government level, it's really about removing some of those hoops. And why do we do things? Is it just because that's just how we do things, or is it a policy? And if it is a policy, how can we create a group to influence that policy? So I hope that answers your question. I want to really just look at it from the broad view, because I think that once you start influencing that, and especially the policies, and especially the that influences the sort of the culture. And once you influence the culture, that influences the way that people are treated when they come in. And they're then feeling as though they have the empowerment as social workers, as mental health professionals, to actually help in what possibly may have been construed as an unorthodox way with a particular client.
Yeah, when you take that really person-centered approach, yeah, and try and make all those hoops become one hoop or no hoops. Exactly.
Yeah, or less people that are interjecting.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to take a bit of a gear change, and it's one of the most popular questions we've had on the Q&A. So, Jeff, you talked about books that you were given when you were in the facility you were in. Was there a particular book or piece of literature that particularly inspired you?
You know, as I had mentioned, I was the contentious young man, right? So I thought everyone was the enemy. And so when I started realizing that the biggest enemy I was going to face was the man in the mirror, I started realizing I had the biggest enemy we'll ever deal with is the person in the mirror. I realized that it was about strategy against myself, my doubts, my life history, those things I couldn't change, and those sort of ghosts that come up and whisper doubts in your ear. And so that meant I needed to strategize. So one of the books that and if you strategize, that means you got to understand strategy. So one of the books that was most beneficial to me was The Art of War. And the reason why that is because it really took on the ideal of being able to understand who the enemy is. It's me. It's my thoughts. It's my way of life. It's my inability to buy into the idea that I didn't need to hurt people to feel as though I was a whole. And then I didn't need to steal things and to rob people to feel as though I had some level of respect and be a part of these different groups and gangs and so forth. So The Art of War was the one that jumps out at me that I still read to this day. And then also Plato's Republic was one that was pretty significant. And in particular, the allegory of the cave portion was one that I would read, and I would really understand more and more about objective versus subject reality, and about what I'm being told versus what really is. And being in life, we often look at things and we say, this is what I think things are. But when we step out, we realize we didn't go certain places or do certain things because of what we thought reality was. And it was really subjective reality based on so many different things that was beating us down, and it was not objective. So stepping outside of that cave of that ignorance allowed me to actually be a better version of me. Some of the two main ones I would read while I was in there. And of course, tons of other books related to strategy, life stories, The Long Walk to Freedom by
Mandela.
Mandela, yeah. Actually, I got it back here. That was a book that truly taught me about resiliency and about being able to sustain and maintain. And also, at some point in time, any face of adversity that I'm experiencing, how do I overcome it, right? How do I overcome it internally? So, and then lastly, the book that I'm gonna skip forward to now because I still continue to read tons and tons of books. Um, um, there's a book by Ryan Holiday called The Ego is the Enemy. And I think that one of my mantras to this day, and I think we'll always think about, is the fact that a lot of times when things don't go well, it's because we have made our ego our amigo. We've made our ego our best friend. And so every day has to be a day of slaying what I call the dragon, which is the ego, right? When you talk to people and they are not buying in, and when we are sort of result driven versus process driven, it's because their egos are hurt. So every day is an effort for me to slay the ego, slay the dragon, because when I think about when things haven't gone well for me, it's because I've embraced my ego and I didn't humble myself.
Thank you. And that sort of leads me on to one of the other questions. So sometimes as professionals, social workers or people working in this area, they will come across young people who seem to not want to engage with the help that's being offered, or are unable to engage with that help, or to have that fight or that battle that you're describing. What tools would you arm a professional with to support that young people that they're working with to do what you've done, to kind of, fight that battle that might be themselves?
Well, that is a great question, and one that I get asked often, and also one that I think a lot of professionals deal with, right? And so the best way to answer that question is two different ways. One is for all the trainings I provided to staff and so forth and what have you, this is one of the main ones. It's what causes a lot of fatigue, compassion fatigue, because we work really hard to give someone choices and they choose neither one, right? And so the ideal is this, and I encountered this a lot in the academia world. When I went into the academia world, I was not a professional, right? I am very unorthodox. I go in, right? And I noticed a lot of them were frustrated because, and this is what I want you to think about in answering this question, in all professionals, are you process driven or result driven? Because if you're result driven, you're gonna always be upset, and you're gonna always place all your value in the results of how someone responds to you. But if you're process driven, then you fall in love with the process. You're able to actually give to people and not expect anything in return. Like I said in the beginning, it all kind of connects, right? And part of that is understanding that result driven is attached to ego. Process driven is attached to being humble and being aware that here's what we are. We're farmers. We're planting seeds. And unfortunately, in our world, we may not see the yield of our planting. We may not see our harvest, but we're planting seeds. And I say that because I'm a time traveler and go back to what people used to tell me when I was a youngster. Those seeds stayed with me, good and bad. But I remember all those different things that people said to me that still stick with me. And some of them took root early, some didn't. Sometimes we're just not there to receive it, right? And so going back now as a professional, and I think about it, I also implore you to understand and look up motivational interviewing and the will of change, and understanding you meet people where they're at. And when you do that, you can truly be process driven versus result driven, and you're less likely to take it personal, which is again tied to result driven and the ego. And as professionals in this field, we have to destroy that ego. And once we do, we'll find that life is so much better. We take things less personal, and we will also be able to truly give ourselves the self care that we need, because when you're taking things personal, it's difficult to get up every day. So my answer pretty much is provide the information. You're a person with tools. You're an agent of change. Provide the tools. They may use it, they may not, but it's not tied to you. And I know it's very easy to say and difficult to do, but don't take it personal.
Great. And I will use the last minute of your time, Jeff, to ask you, what's the strongest message leaders at all levels can share to encourage others towards a trauma-informed approach?
Well, I remember the first time that I became in a position of, I call it transactional managerial role, right? Where the organization said, you're this position. And I remember the CEO came to me and I said, man, I was so happy. I said, hey, I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna do this. And if it takes me 50 hours a week, 60 hours a week, I don't care, I'll do whatever it takes. He said, hold up, Jeff. Keep this in mind. The ideal is that you do it in 40 hours a week. And the way you do that is by understanding that you create a system and a mechanism that lives on far beyond you. That's transformational leadership. And that was my first introduction to transformational leadership. Transformational leadership is changing. It is unselfish. And for people in that transactional managerial role, understanding that their leaders can be them, or it could be the janitor or whoever, it involves being able to empower them. So embrace and understand transformational leadership, create other leaders, make sure you employ succession planning. So you understand the person that you're training your replacement. And then lastly, that's the approach to leadership. How you work with your people that are underneath your transactional role is through servant leadership. You lead from the back. Servant leadership, you share the risk, you bring in everybody, and of course, when it's time to make those decisions, heavy is the head, the crown is on, but that is the role you're in the transactional role. And it isn't to stuff information down someone's throat, it is to provide information so people can take up their particular part, own it, and become leaders in their own right. And some of the biggest and the best leaders I ever seen were not CEOs. Leadership, again, comes from anywhere at any time. And when we realize that, and as people in those transactional managerial roles realize that, I think that we'll see people taking on more responsibility, involving their particular part in that organization. And then when that person leaves, it still lives on beyond them because it's very unselfish, again.
Yeah, thank you. What a great message for people, the leaders of all levels who are on this call today to take away and share with others. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute whiz over the last 55 minutes to hear the story. And I'm sure there was many questions. Well, I know there was many questions I didn't get to. So thank you again so much, Jeff, for your time. And I'm sure I say that on behalf of everybody who's here on the call today.